Welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Hello, all you lovely people, and welcome back to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, and this is episode 68. So, I will be continuing with Norton's Anthology of English Literature in this episode. So, what are we going to learn today? Well, we are going to learn about the Norman Anglo literature. So, I will go ahead and pop over to our reading screen. Ruh-roh, I forgot to do something before this episode, so hold on just a minute. There we go. All right, so jumping in. We have to rewind just a little bit, like everyone should when they are new here. You should go back into the playlist and find episode 3 in the chronological order of things. So if you want to just read or listen to the Wednesday reads, you will find it on episode 3, episode 8, so on and so forth. So I will be jumping on into Anglo-Norman literature. And like I said, I'm going to be rewinding just a little bit into the introduction because there's a little bit of important explanatory notes in here while I'm covering this section in the following episodes. The Normans who took possession. Anglo-Norman literature. The Normans who took possession of England after the decisive Battle of Hastings, 1066, were like the Anglo-Saxons, descendants of Germanic adventurers, who at the beginning of the 10th century had seized a wide part of northern France. Their name is actually a contradiction of Norsemen, a highly adaptable people. They had adopted the French language of the land they had settled in and its Christian religion. Both in Normandy and in Britain, they were great builders of castles, with which they enforced their political dominance, and magnificent churches. Norman bishops, who held land and castles like the barons, wielded both political and spiritual authority. The earlier Norman kings of England, however, were often absentee rulers, as much concerned with defending their continental possessions as with ruling over their English holdings. The English crown's French territories were enormously increased in 1154 when Henry II, the first of England's Plantagenet kings, ascended the throne through his marriage with Eleanor of Aquitaine, the divorced wife of Louis VII of France. Henry had acquired vast provinces in the southwest of France. The presence of a French-speaking ruling class in England and created exceptional opportunities for linguistic and cultural exchange. 4 languages coexisted in the realm of Anglo-Norman in England. Latin, as it had been for Bede, remained the international language of learning, used for theology, science, and history. It was not by any means a written language, but only also a lingua franca, which by which different nationalities communicated in the church and the newly founded universities. The Norman aristocracy for most part spoke French, but intermarriage with the native English nobility and the business of daily life between the masters and servants encouraged bilingualism. Different dialects of English were spoken by the Anglo-Saxons of all social levels, and different branches of Celtic language groups were spoken in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. Inevitably, there was also literary intercourse among the different languages. The Latin Bible and Latin saints' lives provided subjects for a great deal of Old English as well as Old French poetry and prose. The first medieval drama in the vernacular, the play of Adam, with elaborate stage directions in Latin and realistic dialogue in the Anglo-Norman dialect of French, was probably produced in England during the 12th century. The Anglo-Norman aristocracy was especially attracted to Celtic legends and tales that had been circulating orally for centuries. The 12th century poets Thomas of England, Marie de France, and Christian de Troyes each claim to have obtained their narratives from Breton storytellers, who were probably bilingual performers of native tales for French audiences. Sir Orfeo may represent the kind of lay that served as a model for Marie. Breton may indicate that they came from Brittany, or it may have been a generic term for a Celtic bard. Marie speaks respectfully of the storytellers, while Thomas expresses caution about their tendency to vary narratives. Christian accuses them of marring their material, which he boasts he has retold with an elegant fusion of form and meaning. Marie wrote a series of short romances, which she refers to as lays, originally told by Bretons. Her versions are the most original and sophisticated examples of the genre that came known as the Breton lay, represented by Marie's Melun, Landval, Chifferoy, and Bisclavret. It is very likely that Henry II is the noble king to whom she dedicated her lays, and that they were written for his court. Thomas composed a moving, almost operatic version of the adulterous passion of Tristan and Isolde, very different from the powerful version that the same story of Virgil, also composed in the last half of the 12th century. Christian is the principal creator of the romance of chivalry, in which knightly adventures are a means of exploring psychological and ethical dilemmas that the knights must solve, in addition to displaying martial prowess in saving ladies from monsters, giants, and wicked knights. Christian, like Marie, is thought to have spent time in England at the court of Henry II. Thomas, Marie, and Christian de Troyes were innovators of that genre that has become known as romance. The word Roman was initially applied in French to a work written in the French vernacular. Thus, the 12th century Roman de Troyes is a long poem in French about the Trojan War. While this work deals mainly with the siege of Troy, it also includes stories about the love of Troilus and for Cressida, and of Achilles for the Trojan princess Polysena. Eventually, romance acquired the generic association it has for us as a story about love and adventure. Romance was the principal narrative genre for the late medieval readers, insofar as it was centrally concerned with love. It developed ways of representing psychological interiority, with great subtlety. That subtlety itself provoked a subgenre of questions about love. Thus, in the late 12th century, Andreas Capellanus, Andrew the Chaplain, wrote a Latin treatise, the title of which may be translated The Art of Loving Correctly, honest. In one part, Eleanor of Aquitaine, her daughter, the Countess Marie de Champagne, and other noble women are cited as a Supreme Court rendering decisions on difficult questions of love. For example, whether there is greater passion between lovers or between married couples, whether such courts of love were purely imaginary or whether they represent some actual court entertainment. They imply that the literary taste and judgment of women had a significant role in fostering the rise of romance in France and Anglo-Norman England. In Marie's L'Envol and in Creation's romances, the court of King Arthur had already acquired for French audiences a reputation as the most famous center of chivalry. The eminence is owing in large measure to a remarkable book in Latin, The History of the Kings of Britain, completed by Geoffrey of Monmouth, ca. 1136-38. Geoffrey claimed to have based his history on the book in the British tongue, Welsh, but no one has ever found such a book. He drew on a few earlier Latin chronicles, but the bulk of his history was probably fabricated from Celtic oral tradition. His familiarity with Roman history and literature, and his own fertile imagination, the climax of the book is the reign of King Arthur, who defeats the Roman armies but is forced to turn back to Britain to counter the treachery of his nephew Mordred. In 1155, Geoffrey's Latin was rendered into French rhyme by an Anglo-Norman poet called Wace. And 50 or so years later, Wace's poem, turned by Layamon, an English priest, into a much longer poem that combines English alliterative verse with sporadic rhyme. Layamon's work is one of many instances where English receives new material directly through French sources, which may in turn have been drawn from Celtic or Latin sources. There are two Middle English versions of Marie's L'Envol, and the English romance called Yvain and Gawain is a cruder version of Creation's Le Chevalier au Lion, the Knight of the Lion. A marvelous English lay, Sir Orfeo, is a version of the Orpheus story in which Orpheus succeeds in rescuing his wife from the other world, for which a French original, if there was one, has never been found. Romance, stripped of its courtly, psychological, and ethical subtleties, had an immense popular appeal for English readers and listeners. Many of these romances are simplified adaptations of more aristocratic French poems and recount in a rollicking and rambling style the adventures of heroes like Guy of Warwick, a poor steward who must prove his knightly worth to win the love of fair Phyllis. The ethos of many romances, aristocratic and popular alike, involves a knight proving his worthiness through nobility of character and brave deeds, rather than through high birth. In this respect, romances reflect the aspirations of a lower order of the nobility to rise in the world, as historically some of these nobles indeed did. William the Marshal, for example, the fourth son of the Baron of middle rank, used his talents in war and in the tournaments to become tutor to the oldest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He married a great heiress and became one of the most powerful nobles in England, and the subject of a verse biography in French, which often reads like a romance. Of course, not all writing in the early Middle English depends on French sources or intermediaries. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle continued to be written at the monastery of Peterborough. It is an invaluable witness for the changes taking place in the English language and allows us to see Norman rule from an English point of view. The Owl and the Nightingale, late 12th century, is a witty and entertaining poem in which these two female birds engage in a fierce debate about the benefits of their singing brings to humankind. The owl grimly reminds her rival of the sinfulness of the human condition, where her mournful song is intended to amend. The nightingale sings about the pleasures of life and love when the lord and lady are in bed together. The poet, who was certainly a cleric, is well aware of the fashionable new romance literature. He specifically has the nightingale allude to Marie de France's Le Loustic, the Breton word, she says, for Rossignol in French and nightingale in English. The poet does not side with either bird. Rather, he has amusingly created the sort of dialect between the discourses of religion and romance, and is carried on throughout medieval literature. There is also a body of early Middle English religious prose aimed at women. Three saints' lives celebrate the heroic combats of virgin martyrs who suffered dismemberment and death. A tract entitled Holy Maidenhead paints the woes of marriage not from the point of view of the husband, as in standard medieval anti-feminist writings, but from that of the wife. Related to these texts, named the Catherine group, after one of the virgin martyrs, is a religious work also written for women, but in a very different spirit. The Arcrini Wisi, Guide for Anchoresses, is one of the finest works of English religious prose in any period. It is a manual of instruction written at the request of three sisters who have chosen to live as religious recluses. The author, who may have been their personal confessor, addresses them with affection and at times with kindness and humor. He is also profoundly serious in his analysis of sin, penance, and love. In the selection included here from his chapter on penance, he imagines the enclosed life in richly metaphorical ways, mixing pleasure strangely with pain. Right? So that is the section on Anglo-Norman literature. And we will be going to the first section. And hooray! We are going to be going into the myth of Arthur's return. All right, so during the 12th century, three authors writing in Latin, Anglo-Norman, French, and Middle English respectively created a mostly legendary history of Britain for their Norman overlords. This history was set in the remote past, beginning with a foundation myth, a heroic account of national origins modeled on Virgil's Aeneid, and ending with Anglo-Saxon conquest of the native islanders, the Britons. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the chief architect of the history is Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was writing his history of kings of Britain in Latin prose, ca. 1136 to 38. His work was freely translated into French verse by Wace in 1155, and Wace in turn was translated into English alliterative poetry by Layamon in his Brut in 1190. Geoffrey of Monmouth and Wace wrote their histories of Britain primarily for an audience of noblemen and prelates who were descendants of the Norman conquerors of the Anglo-Saxons. Geoffrey wrote several dedications of his history, first to the supporters of Matilda, the heiress presumptive of Henry I, and when the crown went instead to Stephen of Blois, to the new king's allies, and to Stephen himself. Layamon tells us that Wace wrote his French version for Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen of Stephen's successor, Henry II. The prestige and power of ancient Rome still dominated the historical and political imagination of the feudal aristocracy, and the legendary history of the ancient kings of the Britons, especially of King Arthur, who had defeated Rome itself, served to flatter the self-image and ambitions of the Anglo-Norman barons. Perhaps the destruction of King Arthur's kingdom also provided a timely object lesson of the disastrous consequences of civil wars, such as those over the English succession in which these lords were engaged. Folklore and literature provided examples of a recurrent myth about a leader or hero who has not really died but is asleep somewhere or in some state of suspended life and will return to save his people. Evidently, the Bretons and Welsh developed this myth about Arthur in oral tradition long before it turns up in medieval chronicles. Geoffrey of Monmouth, Wace, and Layamon, and subsequent writers about Arthur, including Mallory, allude to it with varying degrees of skepticism. The selections from Geoffrey of Monmouth and Wace are translated by Alfred David. The Layamon's selection is translated by Rosman Allen. For more information about Arthur, see the archive. Okay. Geoffrey of Monmouth, from the history of the kings of Britain. But also the famous King Arthur himself was mortally wounded when he was carried off to the island of Avalon. To have his wounds treated, he bestowed the crown on his cousin Constantine, the son of Duke Cador, in the year 542, after the incarnation of our Lord. May his soul rest in peace. Wace, from Roman de Brut, or Brut, whichever way you want to pronounce it. Arthur, if the story is not false, was mortally wounded. He had himself carried to Avalon to be healed of his wounds. He is still there, and the Britons expect him, as they say, and hope he'll come from there if he is still alive. Master Wace, who made this book, won't say more about Arthur's end than the prophet Merlin rightly said once upon a time, that one would not know whether or not he were dead. The prophet spoke truly. Ever since men have asked, and shall always ask, I believe, whether he is dead or alive. Truly, he had himself taken to Avalon 542 years after the incarnation. It was a pity that he had no offspring. He left his realm to Constantine, the son of Cador of Cornwall, and asked him to reign until his return. Layamon from Brut. And this starts way in the middle of it, so it's just the prose poetry. Arthur was mortally wounded, grievously badly. To him there came a young lad, who was from his clan. He was Cador, the Earl of Cornwall's son. The boy was called Constantine. The king loved him very much. Arthur gazed up at him as he lay there on the ground, and uttered these words with a sorrowing heart. Welcome, Constantine. You were Cador's son. Here I bequeath to you all of my kingdom, and guard well my Britons all the days of your life, and retain them all the laws which have been extant in my days, and all the good laws which there were in Uther's days. And I shall voyage to Avalon, to the fairest of all maidens, to the Queen Argante, a very radiant elf, and she will make quite sound every one of my wounds, will make me completely whole with her health-giving potions, and then I shall come back to my own kingdom, and dwell among the Britons with surpassing delight. After these words there came gliding from the sea what seemed a short boat, moving, propelled along by the tide, and in it were two women, remarkable in attire, who took Arthur up at once and immediately carried him, and gently laid him down, and began to move off. And so it had happened, as Merlin said before, that the grief would be incalculable at the passing of Arthur. The Britons, even now, believe that he is alive, and living in Avalon with the fairest of the elf folk. And the Britons are always looking for when Arthur comes returning. Yet once there was a prophet, and his name was Merlin. He spoke his predictions, and his sayings were the truth of how Arthur once again would come to aid the English. So, what did you think about that and the differences of the three writers? I think they were very, very much so. They were not copying each other, but they were trying to outdo each other, right? So, next time we will be covering Tristan and Isolde in the Norton Anthology of English Literature. So I hope you look forward to that. And if you found this entertaining, delightful, and educational on some part, would you please give me a like, subscribe, and share? And if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments, and I shall get back to you as soon as possible. Have a good night, everyone. Sleep well.